Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
My uncle, said the man with the glass eye, was a very rich man. He was worth about 120,000. Quite. And he left me all his money. I looked at the shiny sleeve of his coat, and then at the worn collar. Every penny, said the man with the glass eye. I've never had any luck like that, I said, trying to speak enviously. Even a legacy isn't always lucky. He remarked with a sigh, looking at his tankard. Perhaps not, I said. He was an author, you see, and he wrote very many books. Indeed, that was the trouble of it all. He looked at me with the active eye to see if I understood his statement. You see, he said after a pause, it was like this. He was my uncle, my maternal uncle, and he had a weakness for writing. Weakness is not the word, it was real mania. He had been librarian in a polytechnic, and as soon as the money came to him, he began to write. It's an extraordinary thing to me. A man of 37 suddenly got much money, and instead of enjoying himself and buying new clothes and other pleasant things, he took a house and ordered in about 5 tons of books and ink and paper and began to write edifying literature. I can't understand it. The money came to him through his maternal uncle, suddenly, when he was 37. My mother was his only relation in the wide, wide world, except some second cousins. And I was her only son. The second cousins had one son, too, but they brought him to see the old man too soon. He was rather a spoilt boy, and when he saw my uncle, he began to cry out loudly, "Take him away, take him away," and so he lost his chance. And my mother, who was a sensible woman, settled the business in her own mind long before my uncle did. He was a curious little man, my uncle, as I remember him. I don't wonder the child was frightened. His hair was black and straight and stiff round the bald crown. His face was white, and his rather large dark gray eyes were moving about behind his glasses. He always wore a long overcoat and a felt hat of an extraordinary size. At home it was, usually, a dirty red flannel dressing gown and a black skullcap. In that black skullcap he looked like the portraits of some celebrated people. He was always moving about from house to house with his chair and his 2 writing tables which had belonged to celebrated men. So the dealer told him, and the completest reference library in England, so he said. What was his name? I'm sure you have never heard of it. He wrote nothing that anyone has ever read, nothing. No one could read it. He wanted to be a great teacher, he said, and he didn't know what he wanted to teach. So he just wrote at large about truth and justice and the spirit of history and all that. Book after book he wrote and published at his own expense. He wasn't quite right in his head, really. And to hear him attack the critics, not because they criticized him, no, he liked that, but because they didn't take any notice of him at all. From 14 up to 23 my mother usually washed me and brushed my hair, at least in the earlier years of it, and took me once or twice a week to hear this old lunatic speak about things he had read of in the morning papers. And I had to sit according to instructions and look intelligent and nice and pretend that I was very interested in it. Afterwards I continued to go to him of my own free will, having in view the legacy. I was the only person that came to see him. He wrote, I believe, to every well-known man, sending him a copy or so of his books, and inviting him to come and talk to him, but half of them didn't answer and none ever came. Well, that was my uncle, and that was how he lived. And he not only talked to me, but he gave me his books of 600 pages or so, with strange headings, all very strong and none of them original. The last time but one that I saw him, he gave me a book. He was feeling ill then, and his hand shook, and he was depressed. I noticed it because I was naturally interested in those little symptoms. My last book, Ted, he said. My last book, my boy, my last word to the nations. And a tear went rolling down his yellow old cheek. He handed the book to me, trembling. Take this book and read it, he said. This is my last word, my very last word. I've left all my property to you, Ted, and use it better than I have done. And then he fell coughing. I remember it all very well because I repeated it and acted it to my old mother when I got home. I remember also quite well even now how he was in bed the next time I came. He was very weak, but even then his vanity did not leave him. Have you read it? He whispered. I sat up all night reading it. I said in his ear to please him, It's the last, said I, and then added, but it's the bravest and best. He smiled a little and tried to squeeze my hand, and then lay still. The bravest and best, said I again, seeing it pleased him. But he didn't answer. I looked at his face, and his eyes were closed, but he was still smiling. It's strange. He lay dead there, an absolute failure with the smile of success on his face. That was the end of my uncle. You can imagine that me and my mother organized a decent funeral. Then, of course, came the search of a will. We began decent and respectful at first, and before the end of the day we had looked for it everywhere, in chairs, bureau panels, and even walls. Every hour we expected those others to come. We asked the housekeeper and found that she had actually witnessed a will. It was written on an ordinary sheet of notepaper and was very short, she said, not a month ago. The other witness was the gardener, and he confirmed all she had said. But we could not find that or any other will. At last a lawyer brought us a will that had been made by my uncle years ago during some temporary quarrel with my mother. That was the only will we could discover, and it left every penny my uncle possessed to that young son of his second cousin, the boy who had cried out, "Take him away," and who had never listened to his talking. The man with the glass. I stopped. I thought you said dash, I began. Half a minute, said the man with the glass eye. I had to wait for the end of the story till this very morning, and I was much more interested than you are. You just wait a little, too. They executed the will, and the other chap inherited, and as soon as he was 21 he began to spend it. And how he spent it. He bet, he drank, he got in the papers for this and that. He spent all the money before he was 30, and the last I heard of him was prison 3 years ago. Well, I naturally had a hard life because all my plans were connected with my uncle's legacy. There were, of course, different periods. Just now it's a period of depression. I tell you frankly, I'm in need of help. I was searching round my room to find something for sale, and the sight of all those books which I had received from my uncle, no one will buy them, got on my nerves. I had promised him not to part with them, and I never kept a promise easier. I kicked them with my boot and threw them across the room. One lifted at the kick, and out of it fell, you guessed dash? It was the will. He had given it me himself in that very last book of all. He put his arms on the table and looked sadly with the active eye at his empty tankard. He shook his head slowly and said softly, "I had never opened the book." Then he looked up with a bitter laugh for my sympathy. Imagine hiding it there, in such a place. He made a pause and then added, "It just shows you the vanity of the authors. It wasn't a trick of his. He had really thought I was really going home to read that book. But it shows you." His eye went down to the tankard again. "It shows you, too, how we poor human beings don't understand one another